Ragnarok, for some the most complete map that Ark has to this day. Released in the summer of 2017, Ragnarok added the DLC creatures of Scorched Earth while combining them with a complete set of creatures from the island. With its vast open landscape, for many years Ragnarok was the most popular map within both the PvP and PvE communities. In total, Ragnarok holds 98 tameable creatures, and I will be attempting to tame all of them within 100 in-game days. Oh, and to make this challenge a little bit harder for myself, I made it so I could only tame level 100 and over creatures. Here's how the first 50 days went. I started off day 1 by spawning on the beautiful beaches of Viking Bay, as I wanted to build my base inside the nearby cave, as it would enable me to have both land and water dinos in the same place. I punched some trees and then attempted to punch out a 140 dodo, but sadly this being was just too weak to be part of my army. Not long after that, I finally found my first tameable dinosaur, and with the help of my trusty slingshot which I had just acquired, I knocked out this level 130 Dilophosaur. While that tamed up, I placed down the first foundations of what would become my starter base. While I was planning on moving into the cave in the near future, it would be impractical to move there without a flyer or cryopods, while also being heavily dependent on the early game resources. In between building my base, I tried to knock out a Pteranodon with a slingshot, but I just couldn't quite do enough torpor in time. By day 2, I'd finally upgraded to bow and arrows, and this time the Pteranodon would be mine. While I waited for it to tame, I had to go through the painfully arduous task of using stone arrows to kill turtles, as I needed keratin to make the Pteranodon saddle. Now I had a flyer, I could get metal much easier, so I smelted some ingots which enabled me to make some metal tools, which I then used to get some crystal. On day 3, I spotted a 145 trike just outside the base, so after taking care of his buddy, I knocked him out. Now I had a couple of dinos to protect, it was time to make some reinforcements to the base. I added some spike walls and a dino gateway, and then after bringing the Triceratops back to base, I went out and found a 135 dodo to add to the collection. This was followed shortly after by a much needed upgrade of a 135 Argentavis, who conveniently popped by for a visit just by base. After running circles around him for a good couple of minutes, I managed to knock him out and then got him some prime which he tamed up with. As day 5 struck, I was feeling pretty happy with my progress so far, and with an Argentavis now mine, I had the ability to search the map for smaller creatures which I could pick up and return to base to tame. However, the next creature I stumbled upon was actually a Megalosaurus nearby base. At the time, I didn't actually realise quite how common these creatures were on Rag, so I was very happy with my find and set about taming it right away. For those of you who don't know, Megalosaurs can only be tamed during the daytime as they are nocturnal creatures which wake up at night. Thus, with the timing of the day on my side, we knocked out the Megalo and gave it some prime to tame up with. With the spare prime that I had from taming the Megalo, I used it to tame this 140 Compy, which had come running up to me, obviously desperate to be tamed. After bringing both new additions back to what was already becoming an increasingly cramped starter base, I decided it was time to make some cryopods. Thus, a long trip out into the desert was required to get some organic polymer, and while there I found this 130 Scorpion, which I took with me back to Viking Bay. By this point I was on a real roll, and Ragnarok's overly inflated levelling system was doing me a real favour, as I found a 130 Patchy and a 130 Parasaur back to back. Sadly, one creature I couldn't yet tame was an Oviraptor, so despite finding this lost soul of a 140 right close to base, that will have to wait for part 2. After being distracted by a whole host of tames, it was finally time to make the cryopods I'd been meaning to make for a few days now. This was followed by an extremely fun narcotic making session, which meant splitting a lot of stacks of meat and waiting for it to spoil, while I used the trike to harvest narco berries. After I'd spent close to a full day doing that, it was day 15, and I thought it was finally time to make myself a taming pen, so I could make the most of my new Argentavis' carrying abilities. The first guest was this level 100 raptor, which I tamed up using raw meat, followed by a level 100 Dodic, which was one of the more painful tames up until this point. The next day I spent a lot of time looking for a new crossbow from drops, but after having no luck and not even being able to access this drop, I gave up and went back to base. I knocked out this tail on the way back and then made a saddle for the freshly tamed up Dodic, before I started farming the stone that I would need to craft the various building materials to move into the Viking Bay cave. After doing this for about half a day, I kinda got bored, so I went back out to look for something to tame, and came back with a 125 beaver, which was one of the few creatures in this challenge that I'd actually have to feed narcotics for. In between babysitting this tame as if I was back on official, I set to work placing the necessities for the base, such as a smithy and a fabricator. The following day, the beaver had finally tamed up, and I was ready to go back to taming. After moving a couple of my previous tames from the starter base into the Viking Bay cave, I managed to grab myself an Ankylo, a Plurvia, and a Phiomia all within the same day. After that, I tried my hand at some building, and let's just say what I create in this episode isn't the most aesthetically pleasing. I can't say I have much experience with PvE building up until this point, so my ability to make things look nice isn't amazing. I will be making much more effort in the final 50 days to make sure the whole cave presentation is a lot nicer, as we will have to fit 98 dinos in here. After finally making some areas to store the dinos, I went on another taming spree. We were over a quarter of the way through the challenge now, and I thought it was making steady, if not spectacular progress. I tamed a tech stego, which was wandering around right near my starter base, and I figured this would be a good time to say that I won't be taming both the tech variants and normal variants. According to Dododex, which I'll link below, these creatures aren't listed separately, so for this challenge I will be treating them as one entity. After taming the stego, I knocked out a 130 saber, and tamed my first water dino, an Onychiosaurus. On my way back to the base from taming that, I found a 145 Lystro, so I brought him back in with me to tame up inside base. The following morning I took a visit over to the northwest side of the map, where you can find Megalanias and various other insect-like creatures. When a 150 Pelagornis out of sheer luck landed right next to me, I thought I may as well tame him up also. On the return flight to base, I found a 150 dung beetle, which I would need not only for the collection, but to make fertiliser so I could start growing some crops. There will be certain creatures in the second part of this episode that I will need crops for, so I set my new dung beetle going with some feces and made the short trip to the nearby snow biome, where I found a 145 Daedon which I brought back to base. I had to kill a Bronto to tame this thing as it wanted a crazy amount of prime meat, but nonetheless he tamed up and our collection of creatures was growing at a rapid rate. A biome I hadn't visited yet was the swamp, so the next morning on day 30 I took a visit out there where I swiftly added a Sarco, Dimorphodon and a Megalodon to the party, and brought back a frog which I tamed up in the taming pen next to base. By day 30 we had tamed a good amount of creatures, but there were still a few big ones that I wanted to check off the list before day 50, so I set about making more narcotics as we would need plenty of tranks for our long flight to the desert biome. In the desert I started off by taming up an Iguanodon and a Morellatops, who I for some reason returned back to base with, before returning to the desert where I first found a Jerboa before knocking out a Thorny Dragon and a Carno. This terror bird then ran rings around me for a good couple of minutes before I could finally knock it out. Returning back from the desert, I grabbed a direwolf which I dropped in the taming pen to tame, before I headed out to find a 130 Patchy Rhino right near base. Patchy Rhinos are another one of the tames on the list which I'd need to feed narcotics for, so I stuck around just long enough to give him the required narcotics for him to tame out. After that, I quickly scoured the Wyvern Trench, but didn't see any suitable eggs that I could see, while also trying to stay out of the aggro range of the Wyverns. I decided to admit defeat with the Wyverns and instead go after this 130 Bronto, which I had seen earlier. I'd made sure to bring enough tranks for it, and after a few minutes I managed to knock it out. With no time to waste as day 50 was creeping over closer, I left the Bronto with some berries to tame up, grabbed the Patchy Rhino and Direwolf on the way home, before setting out to the snow biome to tame this 135 Rhino. The spot where I'd knocked out the Rhino was quite close to the Bronto, so I picked the Bronto up, then came back for the Rhino and brought both back to base. I then set up some crop plots to grow crops with using the fertiliser which my dung beetle had made for me. Outside base, a 135 Rex had been spotted, so of course I knocked that out and tamed him up. I was now entering the last 5 days of part 1 of this challenge, and there were still a few notable creatures I wanted to get tamed up before we hit the landmark. For one of those creatures I would need rare flowers, so I stopped off at a beaver dam to get some. I was momentarily distracted by the Scarilla over here, so I quickly put on my ghillie and tamed him up. Next up, I used the rare flowers to tame this Tapejara over here. For those unaware, Tapejaras normally run away at the first sight of you, so this truly is the best way to tame them, as it made my life a million times easier. When you eat the rare flowers, the Tapejaras will aggro on you, and you can then boulder them and knock them out. After the Tapejara, it was time to go after a griffin, so I made a very basic griffin trap, and despite some difficulties which meant my Argy got stuck inside the trap with it, I managed to knock it out and tame it up. The main reason I was so desperate to get a griffin so soon was because I'd been eyeing up this level 100 Quetzal, which had been floating around base for quite some time. While there are a variety of methods you can use to tame a Quetzal solo, a griffin is by far the easiest, as it allows you to shoot off the back of it. It made knocking out and taming this Quetzal a lot easier, despite its insistence on running to 50-50 on every map. On day 50, I returned to the Wyvern pit and found this beautiful 160 Wyvern egg. Having the griffin now meant I was able to get in and out of the trench with ease, and back at base we set up torches so we could hatch our final creature of the first part of this challenge. Thanks for watching part 1 of this challenge. In 50 days we have tamed a total of 44 out of 98 tameable creatures available on Ragnarok. This wasn't even on purpose, but 50 days into this challenge I have tamed exactly half of the available creatures. I think this is a decent place to end part 1, but there is no doubt that I have a lot of harder tames coming up. So if you do want to see that, be sure to come over to my Twitch channel, and of course I will upload part 2 to YouTube in the near future as well. If you have enjoyed, please do feel free to leave a like on the video and subscribe so you don't miss any uploads in the future. In the meantime, I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you again soon.
Drugs that you're taking are killing your soul. Baby, drugs that you're taking are killing you so.